Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga.
Hello, dear listeners. This is Bungacast. My name is Alex Hochuli. This podcast is also George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe. Hello, boys.
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, hey.
Oh, well done. You got that this time. Well done, George.
I fluffed my lines last time. Hello. Just read check notes. Hello.
Deceptively complicated role to play there. But anyway, this is Bungacast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. We're recording this on Friday, the 25th of November. We are discussing techno-feudalism today, a thesis that's been widely bandied about as a way of explaining certain phenomena in contemporary capitalism. You know, whether it's like growing inequality, the rise of tech barons, the increasing rent seeking or financialization of the economy, and so on. Various other phenomena that you can think of. You've probably come across this term before. And for that reason, we have a thing called a reading club where for patrons who pay $10 a month, they get access to this club where we have been exploring different themes over the course of the year. One of these is techno-feudalism. So we've got several readings ongoing now at the moment until the end of the year, looking in depth from various different angles, from the question of labor to technology to kind of broader synthetic arguments about what capitalism is like today in that section on techno-feudalism. This isn't the reading club, though. This is an exploration of an article by Evgeny Morozov, which is a critique of the techno-feudal thesis, which we're going to be discussing. But I just wanted to say that if you enjoy what you're about to hear, find this interesting and want to learn more, I would suggest maybe checking out the reading club. We also have local reading clubs in various cities around the world where people get together to discuss the material and send in questions, which we then discuss on the episodes. But of course, if you're a late joiner, you're not part of it yet, you can still join and follow along, do the readings, or even not do the readings, because I think the episodes are accessible even if you haven't, done a close reading of the text that we have put together in this syllabus for 2022. So we hope you join us, whether now or for next year's reading club. Anyway, that's all to check out. It's at patreon.com/Bungacast. Now, as to the content, the more interesting stuff, I'm going to hand over to George, who's been manning the techno-feudal thesis section of the 2022 reading club.
Yes, I have indeed been manning that section of the reading club syllabus. And yeah, so this reading for today, Evgeny Morozov's Critique of Techno-Feudal Reason, which was in New Left Review in January to April 2022, came out after we set the syllabus up, so didn't have a chance to include it, but it's on a lot of the key issues and questions in that final part of the reading club syllabus on techno-feudalism. And I think it's particularly useful because it is a really, it's an overview of all the different approaches that you have to these different sorts of techno-feudalism, digital feudalism, information feudalism, Kotkin's version of this, specifically neo-feudalism. And I'll just outline what he says in his book in a second. But this is, one of the most useful things of the article is it takes all of these things. And Morozov also sees a smart feudalism on the horizon, and it kind of lays out some of the theoretical background and assumption. But yeah, just to link it back to that part of the reading club, we discussed Joel Kotkin's The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, a warning to the global middle class. And just to recap that, because I think it's useful if listeners haven't read some of the pieces that we're discussing, this Kotkin can stand in for, some of the general claims that techno-feudalists tend to make. So who is Joel Kotkin? He's a often thought of as conservative geographer, but we at least one of us disagreed with this characterization of conservative on the reading club, based in Orange County in California. A lot of his previous work is about, I guess, the Californian dream and how this state, which previously represented, it was the golden state. It was where you could go and find your fortune. And then it was in the 60s, it had weather, wine, weed. It was this great place to be. And now it has, I think, if anything, a kind of a dystopian connotation, failing power grid, permanently gridlocked I-55, the tech overlords ruling over California, and a kind of a really dysfunctional social kind of place to be. But yeah, so that's Joel Kotkin. His book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, which came out in 2020, is as the subtitle says, a warning to the global middle class. And what he's trying to do in that book is to say there's a change in society, I think extrapolating from California to the rest of the world, and it's a return. Well, neo-feudalism kind of leaves it a bit open, but certainly it has a lot of characteristics of feudalism, the economic and social system that predated capitalism. Particularly, this is Kotkin's argument, it has a specific class structure which is different to labor and capital under capitalism. Instead, you have the aristocracy, the clerisy, and then the third estate, which is made up of the yeomanry and the serfs. And I think the kind of political thrust of the book is that you have a symbiosis between the economic oligarchy and the clerisy, and this is the major threat to the middle class. So in Californian terms, that's the tech oligarchs and the clerisy. So the kind of, you might call them the PMC, you might call them the kind of word spinners or the ideological producers or various other things, but I'm sure we'll get into all of this over the course of this episode. He also says that this neo-feudal society is one which has a set of obligations and a really ingrained orthodoxy. So it's an ordered society with a very fixed set of ideas. He particularly takes aim at environmentalism and some good passages on green indulgences, as he puts it. He also says that this, in terms of the ideas of this society, very culturally pessimistic, declining faith in democracy. This neo-feudal society is also characterized by a concentration of wealth, a decline in upward mobility. It's a very static society. He characterizes populism as peasant rebellions, but this, it's a very fixed, ordered. This is the idea of feudalism, supposed to capture a lot of this sort of society, and it also has its geographical aspects. It has all these gated cities. Christophe Guille's, we talked about this a bit in the Reading Club, and we've talked about Christophe Guille before on this podcast. This idea of citadels and these superstar cities, which are celebrated against other examples of kind of more suburban ways of living, which I think Kotkin would defend. And he cites Milton Keynes for British listeners as an example of this. And just to summarize all of this, and I read this out on the Reading Club episode as well, because I think it's just a good summary of what this neo-feudal thesis is supposed to, I guess, capture or supposed to evoke in the reader's mind. The new feudalism won't feature intrepid knights in armor or fortified castles or raise soaring cathedrals filled with liturgical chants. Instead, it will boast dazzling new technology and be wrapped in a creed of globalism and environmentalist piety. Yet, for all its modernity, the coming age seeks to replace liberal dynamism and intellectual pluralism with an orthodoxy that puts a premium on stasis and accepts social hierarchy as the natural order of things. So we already discussed Kotkin and before on the Reading Club, but before we get on to Morozov's idea, critique of all the different sorts of techno-feudalism, any reflections on our discussion previously on Kotkin?
Well, I think it's worth saying that all of what you've just been describing and what Kotkin describes and other similar authors have also tried to capture are things that are intuitively understandable. I think we all kind of looking around at the contemporary global scene or wherever in the society that you're in, I think a lot of this stuff is immediately felt. That there's this growing inequality, that the world that we knew is falling apart. And so I think everybody's struggling to try to put a label on kind of what's going on in the transformations in global capitalism. We ourselves call it the end of history, right? And I guess the neo-feudal thing has a certain appeal because it says, no, there's something even deeper going on. There's something kind of almost a kind of meta historical transformation going on it's somehow capitalism itself is ending and becoming something else.
Yeah. Phil?
Yeah, I was a big fan of the book. I mean, I don't agree with the neo-feudalism as a thesis, but I thought Kotkin's book was it was a very good read. It was very kind of insightful. He assembles the material well. And on top of that, it was useful to argue against. I think he set up the case for neo-feudalism in a way that, thinking about the claims about changed class structure, indulgences, kind of urban versus rural, all of these things, it's a useful way to think about contemporary social change. So even though you might disagree with it as I do, I think it's a great read, and so it was great to do in the Reading Club.
Yeah, I think reflecting on it, it's that sense of stagnation, or like there's no forward motion to like contemporary capitalism. And so it makes, there are different ways that you can account for this and describe it, but it certainly is a sort of starting point. For me, at least, I think it gives a bit of an impulse to that, like to talking about neo-feudalism or techno-feudalism or whatever, because there does seem to be a backward facing or a kind of stagnation, decay like vibe, if you want to put it that way, at the moment.
Yeah, and the other elements, I think, also the clerisy, the idea, this revived idea of profoundly kind of orthodox and dogmatic ideologues that provide justification and legitimation for the social structure in terms that lend themselves to kind of inquisitorial style persecutions, accusations of heresy, and so on. That I think people would recognize that, but also the fact that rebellion has the feel of peasants with pitchforks and torches. That it's kind of, it doesn't seem to go anywhere. It seems to kind of just disrupt and shake things up, and then produce kind of everyone tightens, battens down the hatches and tightens the screws even further, but nothing seems to come of the peasant rebellions, which in the form of kind of populist insurrections of the ballot box. Yeah. So there are many things to commend, at least superficially, there are many things to commend the thesis. When you kind of go a bit deeper, it doesn't really hold up, and that's what we try to get into a bit in the reading club.
Yeah, I think this discussion can continue some of that, because Morozov's analysis is very much on what are some of the deep assumptions and I guess starting points on what capitalism is and what feudalism is, which underlie the neo-feudal or techno-feudal theses. So if Joel Kotkin is a thinker that Morozov puts on the right, there are also quite a few thinkers on the left, probably more, that Morozov analyzes to a greater or lesser extent, or at least kind of lists as examples of different variants of this techno-feudal thesis. And these include, but are not limited to, it's going to come across a bit like a list of names unless I actually explain what some of these people do or who they are, but feel free to jump in, guys, with a bit more clarification. So Yanis Varoufakis has written on techno-feudalism. Mariana Mazzucato, she is a kind of political economist in the UK, and she's written a lot on moonshots and various
reviving industrial policy, basically, in the developed world.
How to have an entrepreneurial state and in innovation. So she's clearly interested in that sort of thing, and sees feudalism as, or drawing analogies between contemporary society and feudalism as useful. Jody Dean, who we mentioned on the Reading Club as well, who's an American theorist who's criticized some of the, I guess she's more probably critical of some of the techno-feudal theses. Wolfgang Streeck gets a mention as well, who's been a previous guest on this podcast. And somebody who gets quite a lot of time in the essay is Robert Brenner, who's a Marxist historian. And in different ways, and I'm sure we'll draw this out a little bit, Morozov sees some of the things which they say, or some of the accounts that they have of feudal aspects of contemporary society as having one or more of the key assumptions that we're kind of gonna go through. Anybody that I missed?
No, I think that that's a good summation. I think it's worth pointing out that these theorists span a range from kind of center left, effectively liberals of some sort, all the way to Marxist far left, or people who identify explicitly as communists in the case of Jody Dean. So it's obviously something which is a thesis which lots of people have tried to grapple with or use, despite coming from different kind of theoretical and political backgrounds.
Yeah, and I think Morozov does say that to their credit, none of them go so far as to claim that capitalism is, so I'm reading a quote here, go so far as to claim that capitalism is completely extinct or that we're back in the Middle Ages. The more careful of them, like Brenner, suggest that features of the current capitalist system, prolonged stagnation, politically driven upward distribution of wealth, ostentatious consumption by elites combined with increasing immiseration of the masses, recall aspects of its feudal predecessor, even if capitalism still very much rules today. So just in terms of like some of the concrete issues that these thinkers highlight to kind of add some plausibility to a feudal thesis, or whatever qualifier feudal thesis, You have things like the perverse macroeconomic effects of quantitative easing, and this is Varoufakis's account, unearned income generated by tech platforms, this is Mazukatsu, but lots of other people as well, whether Google and Amazon are capitalists or, as Brett Christopher suggests, rentiers, whether capitalism is extractivist today rather than productive, how we should theorize the digital economy and the difficulties of doing so. And I think the overall conclusion, I want to throw it over to you guys, is that, or Morozov's conclusion, is that the popularity of feudal speak, maybe I should have been introducing all the different feudal theses as feudal speak, that's a good phrase. So the popularity of feudal speak is a testament to intellectual weakness rather than media savviness. It is as if the left theoretical framework can no longer make sense of capitalism without mobilizing the moral language of corruption and perversion. What do you guys think? Is this is feudal speak the sign of a weak and degenerated mind?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I agree effectively. I think there's the kind of mediatized aspect that techno-feudalism, neo-feudalism, whatever, is a sexy title. And so Morozov even charges a lot of these authors with writing about what they would write about anyway, talking about, for example, the effects of quantitative easing, and just trying to package it all up by calling it neo-feudal without a real deep examination of the full implications of what that means. So it's a kind of, it's trying to make it sexy. But as he points out, it's not just an attempt at media savviness. It really reflects the fact that people aren't able to think nowadays about what capitalism really is, at least according to kind of traditional Marxian understanding, and so have to rely on things which, I mean, according to Marx, we'll come along to discuss in detail, to what extent this is true. But for Marx, effectively, it is an economic logic which drives capitalism, and that these extraneous things like corruption or perversion or whatever, or some sort of perversion of that economic logic are extraneous to it, and you don't need those to explain capitalism. And there's always there's a political point to this, right? That if you're relying on, if your critique is a critique of corruption, there's a sort of moral component to that, and which also implies that if you got rid of that corruption, then capitalism would be okay, effectively. So the real radical critique, I guess, and this is what Morozov is driving at, is to really get to the root of the matter of how capitalism works, even according to its best possible formulation.
I mean, go on, Phil.
Yeah, go on, George. Well, I was gonna kind of build on what Alex said, but I suppose I would, I'd see this point as cutting two ways. On the one hand, I think it speaks to a certain naivety about what if you wish to characterize capitalism, modern what's happening today as neo-feudalism, it speaks to a certain naivety about capitalism itself, right? Which imagines it as kind of as if it only belongs to a particular era, and that if it changes in any particular direction, it's no longer meaningfully capitalism. And that seems to me to kind of underestimate capitalism as a type of society, but also to perversely idealize it, right? To kind of restrict it to a very particular era, and then to think that any deviation from that era means that capitalism is over. When it seems to me that many of the kinds of things that that you just described, the kind of unearned income, perverse macroeconomic effects, extractivism, rentierism, all of these things are very much phenomena of industrial capitalism, in the sense of the enormous kind of wealth that it produces that can't be effectively channeled, and that it generates these enormous inequalities of income and, de facto kind of parasitism, as all these increasingly kind of superfluous social strata try to get hold of these revenue streams, essentially from this underlying kind of industrial base, or from the underlying forces of production that are so tremendously powerful in what they yield in economic terms, that it generates all these kinds of perverse outcomes. So that would be my kind of my rough take on it.
Yeah, go on.
Well, just to add something, which I think is useful to set this up in a broader sense, is the way that Morozov starts this off by noting that neo-feudalism also allows people to think beyond capitalism, which was supposedly something that, according to Frederick Jameson, was something that we were unable to do anymore. It was easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Now you can imagine the end of capitalism, but only on condition that it's a dystopian outcome, that we return to feudalism rather than move forward to communism or some form of freer society.
It's worth saying, I mean, as against, kind of somewhat, I mean, these are not, Varoufakis in particular. These are not people I'm generally, or Jody Dean. These are not kind of theorists that I'm especially sympathetic to. But to defend them against Morozov, I would say, what they are, they are trying to deal with a genuine question, which is the nature of capitalist society in the absence of the challenge posed to it by organized labor, right? So the underlying question, which Morozov, I don't think he ever really draws out, though he maybe gestures at it, or it's kind of implied, is how do you account for capitalism in the absence of the challenge posed to capital by organized labor? And, it's not a straightforward proposition. So, they are, to that extent, they're trying to kind of formulate these terms, and obviously it's somewhat ramshackle and qualified and caveated with the techno kind of suffix or the neo suffix and all of this, but that is, at the end of the day, I think that is what they're trying to grapple with. Capitalism without a meaningful kind of either political or economic challenge.
Yeah, I mean, just to link it quickly back to this, to our end of history idea, you could even say that, the end of history, to draw on that Jameson quote, you couldn't imagine an alternative to capitalism. But now you have the end of history, so the negation of that, but without anything positive. So you can imagine the end of capitalism, but it has to be a regressive one. It has to go back into the past. And so that's why feudalism is, or neo-feudalism is imaginatively possible. And of course, there are material reasons and changes which make it plausible, and these I'm sure we'll come on to discuss. But yeah, so feudalism, to start with, obviously kind of an important concept to neo-feudal or techno-feudal theses, and just to outline this a little bit, because I think it's quite a it's not necessarily a complex but quite a theoretical argument that Morozov starts with here. So he sees that basically the Marxist tradition has tried to identify an economic logic of feudalism, and he sees it as something like the following. So the peasants possessed their own means of production, so tools and livestock and so on, and also had access to common land. And so they did have some degree of autonomy from the feudal lords in producing their subsistence. Don't have that today. Feudal lords, on the other hand, had few incentives to raise peasants' productivity, and so they basically intervened relatively little in this production process. Any surplus that was produced by the peasants was openly appropriated from them by the landlord, usually by appeal to tradition or law, and this is basically enforced through threats of violence and all sorts of like coercive means. So kind of just to summarize this, then the economic logic of feudalism was peasants had autonomy in matters of production, but little overall autonomy, and landlords, for their part, had little incentive to increase productivity. So it's quite that's a picture of stasis that we talked about with Kotkin just a few minutes ago, and that's leads Morozov to conclude that Marxists basically therefore tended to see the means of surplus extraction under feudalism as political rather than economic, since they didn't arise from the free conditions of contracting, normally free agents like all of us, under capitalism being free, in heavily inverted commas, to sell our labor power, and that's what pertains under capitalism. But under feudalism, it's not. It's violence is the thing that gets the surplus from the producers. So bit of a whistle stop, very heavily summarized kind of idea of the logic of a sort of society which persisted over many centuries in human history. But is Morozov right in this kind of laying out of Marxist approaches to feudalism, and are the Marxists right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's your summation is good, and more what Morozov argues, I think, is fairly uncontestable, at least, from within the Marxist tradition. The peasants went and produced what they produced, and then the Lord came in and stole a bunch of it. And that stealing aspect, or the sense that it's not a kind of equal exchange, is important. And then this kind of notion reappears in the whole language of feudal talk today, as Morozov puts it, in terms of plunder, predation, or expropriation, right? So these are all ways of effectively, to put in the crudest possible terms, of stealing, right? Of taking something from people illegitimately, which is different to the way capitalism supposedly works, where and which many non-Marxists, and actually many Marxists sometimes misunderstand, which is that under capitalism, under market exchange, the exchange is equal. You get paid for the work that you've done. It's legitimate. There's not sometimes bosses steal from workers, sure, but the main way that it works is that you get paid for your labor. It's a fair exchange. That doesn't mean there isn't exploitation, but the exploitation happens within that fair exchange. And so I think Morozov is right in trying to reduce this basically down to the question of whether things work according to this purely economic logic, or whether there's a political logic, whether there's a question of power that comes in terms of, and then violence and so on, in terms of distributing who gets what.
Yeah, no, I think, Phil, are the Marxists right, though? Was feudalism bad for that reason?
Well, I suppose two things. In answer to your question, George, there is a kind of, if you look at some old Comintern or early Soviet posters, there is the tendency to portray kind of the progression from feudalism to capitalism to socialism as a kind of ratcheting upwards in human history, and that's not clear to me that is that is the way in which Marx and Engels themselves understood it in the classical formulations of the theory of historical materialism. So I mean, that's a kind of one point about how you understand historical change, and whether you think of it as this ratcheting effect, with great, improvements in the underlying kind of economic structure, whether it's useful to think in those terms, or whether it's simply the fact that one era unfolds into another, and that's a more basic question. The one thing I would qualify, though, is, the way in which feudalism, I mean, it's a small point, but the feudalism is often used, particularly when it comes to kind of, when it's spoken about in the global level, it's used as a synonym for kind of rural backwardness. When in the classical canon, it's understood as something which is very specifically restricted to Europe, essentially. So this was the kind of the post-imperial social and political structure of Europe. So it's not something which is a global phenomenon. When you talk about feudalism, so anyway, it's a small point, but just to clarify that often feudalism becomes a synonym for rural backwardness around the world, when strictly speaking, as a social and economic structure, it's something which is confined essentially to Europe.
Yeah. No, I think good qualification. So I think we can all sort of vaguely agree that there's something to Morozov's account, or some summary of the economic logic from the Marxist point of view, but he also tries to summarize, again, pretty compressed account, the non-Marxist approach to feudalism, and he says that they tended to understand have tended to understand feudalism not as a backward mode of production, but as a backward socio-political system marked by bouts of arbitrary violence and ties of personal dependence and allegiance, and this is all justified on cultural or religious grounds. What did you guys make of his sort of summary of non-Marxist approaches to feudalism?
It was good. I mean, I thought it's a useful kind of it's a useful distinction that I mean, it's not, I don't know that it holds so much now, but certainly kind of in among early kind of political economy, among liberal thinkers, and among kind of very modern, the kind of founding fathers of modern sociology, that that is the way feudalism is understood. Its problem is that of the way in which it kind of mistreats people and doesn't grant people universal rights. I would say, obviously this was also that the bourgeois critique of feudalism was assimilated into Marxism as well, right? And it obviously recurs throughout many kind of Marxist discussions, political discussions of feudal backwardness. It obviously encompasses a political critique as well as the economic critique. So it's not something that's restricted to non-Marxists. Many Marxists were happy to endorse the critique of the political critique of feudalism, and to see, and famously to see the bourgeois revolutions as progressive from that point of view.
No, and I think that's absolutely right. And there's also, I don't think at a descriptive level, what the non-Marxist understanding of feudalism is and the transition to capitalism aren't at a descriptive level something that you would want to dispense with, right? So the importance of law under capitalism is essential. And I think Marxists obviously recognize that the arbitrariness of feudalism is a factor that we can all agree that is a feature. But it's interesting that Morozov notes, I think very correctly, is that for classic liberals, of course, capitalism, corroded by politics, is always on the verge of lapsing back into feudalism. So that there, I think, is a really important kind of analytical distinction between kind of liberal accounts and Marxist accounts. For liberals, there's always the role of politics. Politics is always somehow a tainted element which interferes in the pure running of the economy, right, of the market. And which feudalism is chastised as an illegitimate political intrusion into the functioning of the economy effectively, and that there's always this risk of feudalism kind of coming back, of illegitimate state intervention in the market. So
just to pose a follow-up on that. So is your suggestion there that, so for liberals you can have a movement back because it's a political system, you can have a movement back from capitalism to feudalism, but for Marxists you can't? Or so my question is,
I think that is
what are the conditions? Yeah, go on.
Well, I think it's just more analytically that for liberals there's a hard separation in reality as well as in their minds between economy and politics, right? And the Marxist tradition, in theory, or at its best, is able to integrate both of these and to understand that they work together, that, it's not state versus market, that the state works with the market and vice versa, that power is important and so on. And so when you get a situation in which you're trying to kind of maintain them separate, like in your head, and also believe that in reality they should always be separate, that there should be no illegitimate state intervention in the functioning of the economy, you end up being surprised or kind of unable to really understand what is going on when you have things like, whatever, the bailouts of 2008. And therefore, then you have to end up reaching for some explanation like, actually, this is feudalism, right? That this is this extraneous element. And I think the whole, just as a kind of summing up of the whole article and argument that Morozov makes, is about how to understand those things which we would understand as extraneous to the economy, right? Those political factors, are they things that are part of capitalism, or are they kind of unjust or somehow up from a part of the outside and then not part of the system?
Yeah, no, I think that comes through in the article, that question is absolutely central. But I did want to pose this follow-up then, because I hadn't been thinking about this until you were saying it. But from a kind of a classical Marxist point of view, to go back to feudalism, you would need the destruction of technology to go back to a feudal era level of technology. Is that right? Is that being too vulgar?
Well, technology isn't important, right? And under feudalism, there's no stimulus to increase productivity. So I don't know if you'd need a destruction of technology. I guess what you'd have is if you had a return to feudalism, you just have a complete standstill in terms of technical innovation.
Yeah,
so I guess the argument is that you have a standstill now, and then you retain this level of technology, but it's turned not towards increasing productivity, but towards other ends, namely kind of plunder.
So Friedrich Engels has he has a point, I can't remember where now, off the top of my head, but he makes the point, there is actually technological innovation under feudalism, and he makes some points about, particularly to do with military, as you'd expect, given what a kind of politically fragmented and warlike system it was, that you do actually have technological innovation. So I don't think, I don't think destruction of technology or technological retardation would be the symptom, right? It would be something more like a changed character of social legal relations, right? So one thing being, famously that people were bound to the land as the Roman Empire as the great agricultural states of the Roman Empire, all the colonies, as they failed to kind of import more slaves, and this is obviously kind of abbreviating and simplifying the thing, but they passed laws that bound Roman citizens to the agricultural estates on which they lived or worked. And so this was the beginning of what would become the kind of the feudal estate, the basic kind of unit of production focused around the lord's manor once the Gothic kingdoms were established. So you'd have to see something on that scale, I think, in which you had a transformation of legal property relations that transformed the nature of work and substituted for the previous kind of way in which production was carried out. I think, that would be much more important than, say, kind of the availability of particular kind of devices or gadgets or machinery or what have you.
To transition onto the next session of the discussion, which is the transition to capitalism, because this obviously is a key aspect of the feudal, any account of society that says we're in a feudal situation at the moment has to have some attention given to how we'd left this this situation previously and what that means. And so I think in Morozov's account, the Marxist approach here, we outlined that economic logic of feudalism in contradistinction to the kind of non-Marxist idea that feudalism was a backward socio-political system. From Marxists, the key kind of transition from feudalism to capitalism is that instead of having an economic logic based on dispossession or expropriation, instead you have one based on exploitation. So this classic kind of Marxist account of capitalism is centered on this, as we've talked about before in this discussion: fair exchange is no robbery, this kind of formally equal exchange of labor power for a wage by free agents. But the Marxist account also has this kind of maybe problematic middle period where Marx describes this as primitive accumulation, which is to say that even on the Marxist account, there is a period in which capital accumulation is famously grounded in violent expropriation rather than exploitation, i.e. taking stuff rather than that free and fair exchange. So Morozov in this connection discusses David Harvey's influential recent idea of accumulation by dispossession as an account of how capitalism works today, which seems rather to take us back to primitive accumulation times. So what do we make of this kind of idea that one of the most important theoretical foundations of the techno-feudalist thesis is the centrality of primitive accumulation to the origins and subsequent development of capitalism?
Yeah, I think this is where really David Harvey really proves the kind of notwithstanding, his kind of technical mastery of Marxist political economy, his attempt to kind of elaborate it or solidify it really indicates his underlying theoretical weakness. So the idea of accumulation by dispossession, or the idea of which is kind of to say that essentially that primitive accumulation is an ongoing process, is I think it's tremendously pernicious, and it has kind of political upshots as well, beyond the kind of theoretical incoherence. I mean,
can you elaborate for us, give us some examples of what this looks like?
Well, it's good that you asked, Alex, because actually I was just about to do that. So Marx, I mean, he presents the idea of primitive accumulation famously at the end of the first volume of Capital. And the point he after presenting the logical account of capital accumulation prior to that, he kind of accounts for its historical origins and talks about how it emerges through the colonial conquest of the Americas, the influx of gold and silver into Europe, the extension of slavery, and famously or infamously the expropriation of the rural landed population in England, which established the basis for what would become eventually the urban proletariat with the rise of industrialism. And he calls this the primitive accumulation, but he took the phrase from the political economists of his own time, who had a different account of the origins of capitalism. Anyway, so, but the point is that Marx presents this very much as the origin. So it's the the very early kind of proto form of capitalism. He doesn't see it as something which defines the ongoing, once industrial capitalism is sufficiently concentrated that it exists of its own accord and is created through the spontaneous kind of process of capital accumulation and exchange of capital for wage labor and so on. He doesn't take primitive accumulation as being meaningful or central to the way in which capitalism functions. So to introduce the idea of accumulation by dispossession, as Harvey does, is to suggest that primitive accumulation is kind of a stage or something which carries on throughout capitalism's development and history. It's not just the kind of the pre-capitalist formation. And I think that, that confuses things a great deal, right? And it's to mistake, so to see, like, I don't know, say chattel slavery in Mauritania, to see that as kind of accumulation by dispossession, or to see, say, when the kind of right-wing paramilitaries kind of clear out agriculturalists and peasants in Colombia in order to make way for palm oil plantations, to see that as accumulation by dispossession. I think that is to profoundly mischaracterize what modern capitalism is about. So these things happen, but they're not central to its functioning. And to suggest that they are is to make a much more confused picture of what the problems, the core problems with capitalism are, as well as to kind of misdirect our attention, I think, to what those core problems are, to confuse questions of core and periphery, and also implicitly, to suggest that the problems, say, in, I don't know, palm oil cultivation in Colombia or something, are problems of backwardness rather than problems of the way in which capitalism functions today. And to suggest that, what's needed is kind of more modernization and development. And, so I think the whole idea of accumulation by dispossession is a profoundly confusing element to introduce into your picture of capitalism, if you want to talk about it. And it's to Morozov's credit that he identifies the fact, that there is a concession to neo-feudalism in the Harveyite thesis, right? By bringing accumulation by dispossession into it.
Yeah, and I think
that's a very good point.
And I just want to add something onto that with regard to David Harvey, who of course is very popular. I mean, within the context of the left, and his lectures are widely listened to, and so on. For him, this question of accumulation by dispossession was not just as Marx would have it, something that kicked off capitalism. Like that, this was this initial step that happened almost, that accidentally led to the creation of capitalism, the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Nor is it, as Phil has been describing, something that kind of recurs throughout history, but is something that is central to neoliberalism, that a kind of accumulation by dispossession kind of comes back with a vengeance, or becomes even more central to capitalism in this phase, rather than compared to the kind of the mid 20th century or kind of late 19th century or whatever. So I think, that's kind of, I don't know how, I'm interested, Phil, how you read that, because his argument isn't just, hey, dispossession, accumulation by dispossession. This question of expropriation is really important throughout all of capitalism. He says, no, it becomes more important now at this point in history, or as of the 1970s.
Yeah, I mean,
80s.
again, I suppose you could, if you wanted to I suppose generously you could say it's indicative of of stagnation in terms of economic productivity and industrial expansion. But even then, I think, I mean, that would be perhaps even that would be, I think, too much of a concession and a stretch. I think, the case remains that once you have industrial capitalism, the question, in terms of the political, at least, the Marxist kind of political economic critique of capitalism has to be addressed to industrial capitalism itself. So the elements that happen on the periphery, where you have kind of the straightforward kind of application of political violence to achieve economic ends, is obviously not, like, it's not an insignificant thing, not least for the people concerned, but it is not central to the questions of if you want a political economic critique of capitalism, you have to account for the core of it. And the way in which the Harveyite point has functioned has, of course, been to deflect from the problems of, or from the question of class contestation in the industrialized world, and to increasingly kind of make the critique of capitalism about the impoverishment or brutalization of kind of rural, indigenous, or displaced people at the periphery. Which, like I say, I mean, it's not to minimize their oppression and suffering, and to obviously they need political redress, but it's not actually at the core of what the Marxist understanding of or critique of capitalism is.
So, I mean, I think it also has, I mean, the appeal that it obviously has is because it carries this moral charge, which the kind of a more pure, clean Marxian understanding lacks. I mean, it's deliberately anti-moralist.
Right. Yeah.
And this says, no, there's this illegitimate violence happening, right?
Yes.
And so it brings this onto the train of justice rather than being a question of freedom of transition out of this system, right? Of revolution, effectively.
I mean, that's right. Yeah.
And so, I understand the appeal. There is, though, one thing. So why don't you go ahead, George? Because I have a point about core and periphery, but George.
Yeah, no, I think it makes you think just more about the importance of exploitation. And this is definitely a phrase which has slipped off the, I'm going to say slipped off the cliff. That's not quite right. It's definitely not talked about as much as it was, and the actual centrality of this to Marxist understandings of capitalism, and the fact that it is, as you guys were both saying, it's specifically not a moral critique. It's not it. Well, some philosophers have argued at great length whether it is or it isn't. I think it definitely isn't. It's not supposed to be a moral criticism. It's not saying this exploitation is bad. It's saying this is how this form of society reproduces itself, and this is the central relationship within it. But yeah, I think that accounts for it. It's the moral appeal and the moral focus and the moral value behind this kind of focus on oppression and accumulation by dispossession. But Alex, you had a core periphery point. You are a man from the periphery to come in with the point for the peripherals.
Well, no, I mean, so Morozov recognizes, and along similar lines of what Phil was describing, that this question of expropriation, to put it to kind of sum it up, because there's various different ways we can talk about it. I've listed some of them already, but dispossession, plunder, expropriation, primitive accumulation, predation, all these kind of things are kind of adjacent terms, right? But to kind of sum it up and say, expropriation, as opposed to exploitation, that expropriation is important in the periphery and always has been, and to a certain extent. And one of the kind of arguments that is kind of nested within this article is about how important that kind of unequal exchange with peripheral countries actually is to the functioning of capitalism. So that in the core, it is just kind of pure industrial capitalism, but out, in the periphery, there's a lot of expropriation, which then gets funneled back to the north and so on, right? But what Morozov hints at the very end of this is an idea which, obviously I'm going to say, that I've already discussed in terms of Brazilianization, but which is this idea that the features of the periphery are now, kind of increasingly present in the core. So the argument there, and here Morozov provides not an opening to techno-feudalism, because he's pretty forthright in his rejection of it throughout, and it's very well argued through, but he opens up to this idea not of a return to feudalism, but in some sense an important change in global capitalism, and that change would be precisely a greater role. And it's a question of proportion. It's a question of quantity, not of an absolute yes or no. But that greater role for expropriation in the kind of maintenance and reproduction of capitalism within the core, right? Which the argument that over the 19th and 20th centuries that wasn't the case, and so he does hint at this. I'm wondering what you guys make of that.
So are you trying to say that Brazilianization has some parallels with neo-feudalism in that it's a kind of a taking of what's supposedly peripheral, extraneous, and it's
peripheral isn't extraneous.
Things...
Sorry, just a correction, but peripheral is not extraneous, because the periphery of capitalism is part of the whole system. It's not something which is the core of capitalism doesn't function without the periphery, right? It's not like you could have Western Europe cut off from the rest of the world and it would still continue to be wealthy. So it's not extraneous. But anyway.
Okay. But yeah, so the idea would be that things which are peripheral but not extraneous come increasingly to define those things which were core, the interpenetration of opposites and all that sort of thing. That would be the idea.
Just basically that these forms of expropriation, which have been always central to the functioning of capitalism in the periphery, in a way which is much more obvious than in the north, right? Phil made reference, clearing out peasants and to take their land to do kind of monocrop agriculture and whatever, some things like that. Or even, slum clearances and whatever else, right? That the kind of more naked use of violence, which is a feature of, life on the periphery, is increasingly becoming a feature of the core, which does not mean a return to feudalism, but more just it is a way of discussing the stagnation of capitalism now, such that capitalism increasingly needs to rely on directly political means. And that's the extent of the claim.
What are you thinking of? How does that happen in the core? You don't have peasants being turned off the land for kind of cash crop.
No, and in a lot of the,
just to be more concrete about this, say you're maybe like an academic living in, say, the southeast of England. How is this how is the periphery making itself more felt in your kind of sheltered, kind of ivory tower sort of life? Just to take an example.
Well, forgive me, for speaking on behalf of the PMC, because I know that is like what George likes to do, but particularly the self-hating PMC. But and it's true that I'm not a rural laborer, but as far as I can tell, there haven't been local militias deployed in order to kind of extend the local cocaine crop, or to set up a palm oil plantation in Kent. Anyway.
Well, no, and it's worth pointing out that in the more developed parts of the periphery, that isn't even necessarily the kind of key picture of expropriation today either anymore, right? We can't talk about
no, but I'm asking you, okay, but so joking aside, if you're saying that we're seeing more of that kind of being transplanted, what are you thinking of?
Well, okay, so to take an example which has been very widely discussed, and which Robert Brenner, the kind of key thinker, I think, of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, discussed as escalating plunder, an article which Morozov makes reference to here, talking about the COVID bailouts, which is a direct political move to transfer wealth upwards from the populace at large to the biggest asset holders, right? And that happened with the COVID bailout to a massive degree. And so the point there isn't about some sort of primitive accumulation necessarily, but it's more about plunder, as Brenner calls it. But basically, it's that capitalism is increasingly dependent on the state, increasingly dependent on forms of in some cases forms of rent, but also just much more. And I think I'm kind of foreshadowing to maybe something that I think George wanted to come on to, but which is the role of the state, right? And that stagnant capitalism relies much more on the state, and that reliance on the state and the reliance on effectively ultimately on violence, even if it's like legitimate violence carried out by the state, it was always a feature of life of capitalism on the periphery, and that's becoming increasingly a feature of capitalism.
Yeah.
That's the argument, basically.
it's a hard, so I mean, it has an appeal. It's a hard one, I think, because how far do you wish to go back? I mean, if you take, for instance, I mean, it was one of the kind of, one of the some mid 20th century German Marxists made this case about, the German kind of so-called economic miracle in the aftermath of the Second World War, which is, in many ways the kind of high point of industrial capitalism in terms of economic growth and expansion and, the modernization of Germany and so on. But they make the case it was only possible by virtue of fascism and war, right? So the incorporation, the fact that the kind of the rebelliousness of the proletariat in a very basic level, not just in terms of its political defeat, but just that it was so kind of subdued and beaten in every conceivable sense by fascism, occupation, and war, and so on, that the social ground was laid for the so-called Wirtschaftswunder. So my point being that it's so, it's very hard to know where to draw a line around such claims, because you can take the high point of industrial capitalism in the 20th century and very clearly at least plausibly identify a link with a profoundly important role for the use of state power in laying the ground for it.
Well, so that is more
not something which is just about today.
Yeah, no, and I mean, just briefly, this is kind of a thing that Morozov, like a kind of secondary point that Morozov wants to make in this article, which is that, kind of Marxists orthodox Marxists should be a little bit more open, at least, and this is a kind of, I guess, a critique of the kind of very pure Brenner thesis, right? That it's all purely economic and that all the political stuff is extraneous, to be a little bit more open in the vision to the role that the state plays in capitalism.
So you've mentioned Brenner a couple of times, Alex. Just in terms of, could you just give us a bit of a summary of what his general vibe is, what his theory of transition?
Yeah,
is?
I mean, not to go into too much detail on it, but the kind of school of so-called political Marxism around him understood the transition of from feudalism to capitalism as something that came about effectively by accident, and it's that that primitive accumulation played a role in I'm kind of repeating to a certain extent the description that's already been made, but that kicked off accumulation, but that it is driven by its own internal processes, and that the force of competition drives innovation, right? And it's that innovation, the desired drive to cut costs, innovation, new technology, greater surplus value, and so on, and so the wheel turns, right? Not that story is without crisis, of course. That is something that is an important part of the process of capitalist development, but that these are things which are all very much internal to the functioning, to the kind of economic functioning, and which. And so the argument that Brenner is making is in contradistinction to other arguments, and Morozov sets up Immanuel Wallerstein as a sort of counter, or as the sort of counter to that, which would be an argument where the political is much more present, and that the role of, for example, imperialism and the unequal exchange with the third world and all that becomes much more kind of central to the way that capitalism functions. So you can basically see it as to put it in kind of really kind of dumb, simple terms, the kind of like the purists versus the ones who think that the story's a little bit messier.
Yeah, nice summary. Great. So just a few more sort of general discussions. I think it's worth probably just in wrapping up to a certain extent bringing in Morozov's background and expertise a little bit. He's a prominent theorist of technology. His book, particularly To Save Everything, Click Here, which outlines this idea of solutionism, I think is just a brilliant account of how essentially there's not just solving problems, but the very formation of problems, those sorts of things that tech can solve. A lot of interesting stuff that he's done, and so we definitely have to take seriously his analysis, for example, of Google. What did we make of this, and the centrality, I guess, of his claim that Google is a commodity producer to his kind of skepticism towards the techno-feudalist thesis?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the, or kind of critically assess his claims about the inner workings of Google. I mean, not even necessarily the inner workings, but his, interpretation of what it actually provides. Because I'm kind of not so immersed in kind of how the technology actually works. But yeah, I think it's compelling. It's compelling, and it's very important, the claim that he makes, because what he's basically saying is that the techno-feudal thesis rests on the idea that these new tech overlords, these new tech barons, are rentiers, right? That they're living off of other people's labor. That they're not just living off, they're not living off of other people's labor, but it's unearned income, in the sense that they're not even exploiting workers directly, right? That there's basically not really many workers doing work. They just own, they have either a kind of monopoly, which they're able to extract monopoly rent, or own patents, which they're able to make rent from without having to put labor to work and innovate and all the rest. And that's certainly part of it, undoubtedly. And he also points to other kind of, again, the extraneous elements. For example, the tight interlinking between Silicon Valley and the US state, both through kind of like lobbying and that kind of thing, but also through its kind of links with the U.S. security state and what it provides to them and so on. But the central point is that a lot of kind of Google's business, and this applies not just to Google, is that it actually sells a commodity, right? So it's not just a rentier, that it has people working, creating the algorithm or whatever to do the web scraping job, kind of web crawling to index the whole internet, and that it then gets people to use its search engine. It collects people's data, and then it sells that data to advertisers. Now, we might say that's not very useful, right? In terms of not producing lots of use values, right? Things that we find useful on a kind of subjective level.
Right. Search engines are useful. How are they not useful?
No, because what's sold is, of course, your data to advertisers. So the fact that advertisers can pinpoint us and target advertising, we might think that's not useful.
Yeah, but it's sold off the back of the use value of the search engine, right?
Yeah. No, that's true. So, but that's something that could be provided freely without the extraction of data, right? So once you've built Google, it could be free, right? Without it kind of absorbing all these masses of data of what you do on the internet. So we might not like it, but there's lots of capitalism that we might say we might not like, but it is still productive of new value. It produces a commodity. Now, Google, and this is part of Morozov's argument, is that it's able to suck up that value, and that this is a kind of a classic Marxist point, that basically the value that's extracted, right, the kind of the money that capitalists make doesn't always come from where they produced it, right? So it might be that something else, mining, for example, is really productive, but it's someone selling something way down the line is able to make much larger profits off of something. It doesn't mean that that's where it was produced. So he gives this example of an automated car wash, right? So the automated car wash, which has no workers, might make loads of money. Now you might say, well, where's the exploitation of labor that happens? Where's the surplus value being created? And the point there is that it doesn't need to be created right there. It's that, the surplus value is in the building of the machines, for example, and the making of the brushes and the soaps and all the rest things that a car wash does, as well as the algorithm that drives and whatever else. It just so happens that the car wash is able to, at that kind of point in production, able to absorb all that value. So, a similar argument, I guess, is applied to Google. Anyway, to conclude, the point is that they still are capitalists. They still are traditional capitalists, for all that there might be other rent seeking going on. And that rather undermines the central conceit of the neo-feudal thesis, that basically they've all become rentiers.
But it also kind of gives you an understanding of why it might be plausible at the same time, because the biggest kind of most high profile capitalist firms don't seem to produce anything. It's not immediately obvious what the kind of how exploitation works, where their factories are that are churning out all of these products, and it does give the appearance that things have changed qualitatively. But just a couple of kind of questions about
but sorry,
political...
just but that, I mean, that gets to a kind of different question. I think it's almost like a kind of category area when people talk about these things, because the production of intangibles doesn't mean that it's not capitalist production, right? And I think that's important. Of course, if it's a song that you own the rights to and that then gets played a million times over, like Happy Birthday, and every time someone sings it, you earn money. Okay, that's pure rent seeking. But you might be providing, as Morozov argues about Spotify, a product you're offering, and the product isn't just the songs, which you've bought the licenses to, or whatever. Is that you're producing this kind of curated content experience. Okay, we might think that's bullshit, whatever, but the point is that you are still producing and selling a product. It just happens to be intangible, and that isn't something. Of course, that's something increasingly a feature of contemporary capitalism, but it's not something that's entirely new, right? For-profit education, that sells something that's intangible, but it doesn't make it any less of a capitalist enterprise.
So well put. I think that's a good point. But just to kind of, politically, is the conclusion here that techno-feudalist or neo-feudalist accounts, those based in mechanisms of accumulation by dispossession, as Harvey put it, or Veblen's predation, or cognitive rent, extraction of behavioral surplus, all these theorists Morozov discusses, but we don't really have time, to get into, is the basic political conclusion that they're all essentially defending the status quo to a greater or lesser extent because they occlude exploitation as the central mechanism of capitalism. So they distract us from where the action is and send us off in opposite directions to where the real reproduction of capitalism is occurring.
I don't know if it's status quo, but they're in some sense, don't get to the centrality of exploitation. I think this is where the diversity of perspectives that use the neo-feudal thesis comes in and is important, because they might be pointing in different directions. So, Varoufakis, wants some sort of reform of capitalism to a more productive form, this critiques of quantitative easing, for example, and the inequality that comes out of this stagnant form of capitalism. But I think there is certainly an occlusion of the central component of exploitation there by focus. So I think we can be critical, for example, of the financialization of the economy, while not falling into the trap of being kind of anti-finance capital and hold up kind of industrial capital as an alternative, because of course, as we know, they're entirely interlinked. So it's not so simple as to say, well, finance capital bad, industrial capital good. Not to mention that often ends up leading to a kind of anti-Semitic sort of terrain. So I think I don't know if they're defenders of the status quo, but I agree that at least from a classic Marxist perspective, that it does sort of occlude the central question of exploitation and turn our eyes to these extraneous elements that if only they were gotten rid of, we might have a good capitalism. The best side of the neo-feudal thesis, to kind of give it its credit, is that it is an attempt to grapple with stagnation and rentierism today, which are very real. I just think that it's misguided in trying to try to understand it through the lens of feudalism, because so much of what's happening is a feature of capitalism and always has been. But maybe it's things that are only now becoming major factors in the core of capitalism, or things that are becoming more present where they were previously less present. And I think I don't think we need that much conceptual innovation in terms of relying on neo-feudalism to try to understand what is going on in our world today.
Phil, are the old ideas still the right ones?
Yeah, up to a point. I mean, I think Alex is. I'm not sure I agree fully with. I think Alex was a bit overwrought, perhaps, in the way he put it. But yeah. What did you want to say?
Well, no. I'm saying elaborate. If you disagree.
Don't be so overwrought, Alex. Come on.
I guess. I mean, it doesn't. The issue remains. I think that if you have these kinds of, the capital wage labor relationship still seems to me to be the core one for understand. If you want to understand capitalism, it seems I'm sufficient of a classical Marxist to think that's the central one to understand. But it still leaves us with the problem that you have part of the reason that you have so much focus on all of these other kinds of questions and trends and phenomena of modern day capitalism is that there is no basic contestation over the social surplus, or at least there hasn't been, with possibly with the possible exception of the recent uptick in strikes in the industrialized economies of the US and Western Europe. Even then, it's starting from an extraordinarily low base, so you don't want to overstate that. But without, so it seems to me, that has to be also factored in.
Yeah, I don't want to abuse my position as sort of the host of this, but I wanted to throw my 2 cents in there. I think why this is an interesting piece to read and an important topic to discuss is that it seems to kind of get to the central question of whether capitalism can work without the things usually taken to be extraneous to it. And I think the general consensus on the left seems at this point to be that it can't, that exploitation does need to be supplemented by an analysis of oppression and domination, bringing in concepts of unfree labor, racial and gender domination, unpriced use of energy, and all these kind of ideas of kind of extra economic extraction at the periphery, enabling straightforwardly economic extraction in the core. That kind of, it's kind of a symptom of a wider kind of eclipse of exploitation as a central concept, and that kind of wage labor relation becoming kind of less and less kind of core to the left's understanding of capitalism. But anyway, I don't think we didn't finish the discussion on any of these things really definitively in this afternoon, but we do have the reading club to continue to discuss these things, and we will shortly be doing a book on AI, which is very relevant in this connection, and also finishing the year discussing the precariat, discussing new forms of class struggle without class, and continuing, I think, probably into next year. Well, I'm sure into next year, a lot of these questions of class, the changing nature of capitalism, all the good shit. So thanks for being with us, listeners. Alex, anything to add? Because you're normally the host, you normally conclude this. I don't know how to finish the conversation. I just say goodbye and drop the mic.
You struggled with hello, so goodbye might also be a little bit difficult.
Well, the start and the end of something is always the most difficult bit, right? The transitions.
Yeah. But that's right. I think, as much as we might be, pretty skeptical of the neo-feudal thesis and all the feudal talk, the stuff that it tries to describe are stuff that needs to be analyzed. And so we're going to continue doing that. If you would like to join us in the reading club, please do so. It's patreon.com/Bungacast. It's $10 a month. If you're not interested in that, but aren't a member or a subscriber to Bungacast yet, for $5 a month, you get 2 original episodes a month, at least, featuring extended interviews, original discussions, analyses of current events, and our ongoing critical dialogues with our patrons, which we greatly enjoy doing every month. So we'd love to see you over there. And regardless, if you have enjoyed this, drop us a review, give us even 5 stars if you would like. That would be great. And we will be back soon with more. And as George said, these discussions will be continuing well beyond just the 2022 Reading Club and the Reading Club itself. It's something that we will continue doing here on Bungacast. We will see you next week. Catch you later. Bye-bye.